A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Today, we have one of the best ever Outback storytellers with us. He wrote the book called Tell Me Another, a storyteller's search for Australia's lost faith. And there are some amazing stories of explorers, poets, bushrangers, cameleers, riverboat captains, and ordinary Aussies that shaped Australia. And our special guest today is Dr. Paul Rowe. He's an historian and a tour guide from the outback of New South Wales. He spent 50 years engaging audiences eye to eye, mind to mind, and heart to heart with Australia's powerful stories of faith. And he's preparing to be our Vision Ambassador on a 10-day Discover Australia's Christian Heritage Tour in November. His doctorate is in history that focuses on telling our Australian Christian story. And his book is called Tell Me Another, a storyteller's search for Australia's lost faith. Dr. Paul Rowe, I want to welcome you to 2020 Today.
Good morning, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Paul. So tell us what's been happening with you lately.
Well, I've been caught up with organising this Vision Tour, is one thing, but I've also been working with a network of schools called Pacific Christian Schools down here in New South Wales, and I'm helping them. They've called me their storyteller in residence or writer in residence, which I'm working out. It means that they want me to help their teachers get a hold of these stories so that we can embed them in the course for children. So we're getting the next generation to know their story because, well, I think like Judges 2:10 says, a generation grew up who knew not the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And I think that's where we are in Australia. I don't think Australians have got a clue about how much they owe to Jesus.
Absolutely. I mean, I know a lot of Aussies would think, oh, yeah, the UK have had their revivals under the Wesleys and the Americans had their revivals under Jonathan Edwards and Charles Finney and D.L. Moody and Billy Sunday, but many would say that Australia was not as marked by Christianity. But what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, we're a different style of Christianity, if you like. We have had revivals here, and there's plenty of evidence of that. But I think distance, isolation, the convict beginnings, and all the sort of issues of colonialism and industrialism came together in a bundle in the 19th century and shaped Australia. But in amongst it all, there were strong and thoughtful evangelicals particularly, but people from the Catholic wing as well, who were well placed to be shaping Australia. And I think that's the thing that's being lost. And I love just finding those stories everywhere. Everywhere I go, as I say, I've got a little saying that says, Jesus' footprints are all over Australia. And you've only got to open your eyes and you'll see it. But I think there was a professor at Macquarie University I met, and he said, Australia is not post-Christian, it's profoundly Christian. It just doesn't know it. And what we need to do is to reintroduce Australians to the Jesus they ignorantly serve. And I like that. I think that's the way it is.
Yeah, I like what you said. So the footprints of Jesus are all over Australia. You've just got to look to see them. I love that. So, okay, Paul, hit me with some great stories then, because some of our listeners aren't aware of any of the things that you're saying. So let's talk about the First Fleet as an example. Tell our listeners today about the Christian influence on that First Fleet to Australia.
Well, Professor Stuart Piggin has done a lot of work on this, and one of the amazing things he discovered, for example, in the shaping of the actual fleet, selection of the boats, the provisioning and everything for the fleet itself, was done by an evangelical member of the hierarchy in England. I've just forgotten his name right now. But he and his wife were profoundly influenced by the Wesleys, and they shaped that fleet so successfully that it arrived pretty much intact within a day or two of each other and was rated as one of the most successful maritime convoys in history. It was amazing, and they lost very few people to illness compared to the second fleet, which was run by former slave traders, and it was badly botched, so there was no comparison. So right there in the designing of the fleet, and then in the background, Andrew, there was an astonishingly well-trained and well-thought-through little community of Christians called the Clapham sect, which William Wilberforce and John Newton were probably the best known, who were shaping in the background the way that things would go with the First Fleet. So,
yeah, now let's just stop there because some of our listeners don't know who those two characters are either. So William Wilberforce was a very committed Christian who helped abolish slavery in the British Empire. And then you've got John Newton who wrote Amazing Grace. And you're saying these two individuals had a big say in the composition of the First Fleet.
Well, Newton actually was very instrumental in shaping William Wilberforce's Christian walk and also the choice of the first chaplain. So he went to Pitt, the Prime Minister, and said, look, we would like to place one of our trainees on the First Fleet as the chaplain. A guy called Richard Johnson was one of their trainees. But when they asked him, he said, no way in the world, I don't want to go to the other side of the world, and that's too hard and too difficult, and it's wild and untamed. So initially he wasn't ready, but then as he thought and prayed about it, he thought, well, actually, somebody's got to do this. And it's not very well known, but John Newton actually wrote the first poem about Australia, and it was for Richard Johnson. And it was saying to him, you are going to be the pioneer, you are going to be the hero who will bring the gospel to the South Pacific, not just to Australia, but you'll be the first to arrive there with the gospel. And that's a component of what we call colonisation. Was also, as Stuart Piggin says, well, the Christians actually hitched a ride on colonial expansion, and they were sort of the passengers, if you like, who arrived with perhaps a different agenda to the colonisers.
Yeah, look, this is amazing. I just want to stop there again for our listeners. So the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, which is the most performed song in English-speaking history anyway, I'm pretty sure world history, actually wrote the first poem about Australia, and he gave it to the first chaplain, Richard Johnson, Reverend Richard Johnson, to encourage him to come and serve God in Australia.
Exactly, and it was, because he was a little bit timid, you can understand, bringing his family here, and it was pretty wild and unknown, and his congregation was going to be mainly convicts and soldiers. And I said to people, well, he and his wife were probably the only, true volunteers on the fleet. The rest sort of had to come, but they volunteered.
Amazing. So that's in our Christian history, isn't it, as a nation, that someone paid a huge price, came to an unknown land, on the other side of the world, and came out of a sense of calling. And I believe Reverend Richard Johnson prayed a lot, like you said, before he came, and sensed in his heart God wanted him to come. And again, many Christians in Australia don't know that, do they?
No, and one of the things we're going to do on the tour, Andrew, is to go to St Philip's Church in Sydney, one of the earliest churches. And there they have his prayer book, and that he was given by and then the things for the communion, like the cups and the plates and things, were given to him by the king. They're still there, and that prayer book, I think, has been signed by every member of the royal family who's visited Sydney. So it's pretty interesting to see. I've seen it before.
That's amazing. So Reverend Richard Johnson's prayer book is still in that church in Sydney, and you can actually check it out and see all the different kings and queens who've signed it as well.
Exactly. I'll tell you, an interesting thing was, Andrew, we did this tour once before with Stuart Piggin, and he got access to the Mitchell Library, and they have all Richard Johnson's letters, and some of them come from the very first days of the colony, and it's quite amazing. We took some school kids with us because we wanted to engage the younger generation with these stories, because they're the ones that have got to carry this forward. That's what I'm passionate about. And it's not just a heritage tour for old people like me to sort of get sentimental about it, but we're talking about the things that are fundamental to Australia that our new generations need to know. And we took these kids there, and I can remember these kids' faces very, very clearly as they looked at these early letters. They were just bright with astonishment and excitement and hope that somehow that what they were being taught at school, a Christian school, wasn't just once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, but it was fundamental. It was the roots of our very society and something they could be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And every Christian should be proud of that as well. And we should really try and tap into that faith. So, Yeah, I'm kind of excited about this tour, Paul. I wonder if
Well,
I
you
can.
want me to come?
I think I better. So it's later this year, and it's called Discover Australia's Christian Heritage. Now, listen to this, everyone. It includes a Sydney Harbour dinner cruise. We're going to check out Botany Bay, and I say we because I am coming now. We're going to check out Australia's Christian heritage sites. We're going to check out historic churches, and we're going to see museums and historic houses with the ultimate tour guide, the Reverend Dr. Paul Rose. So if people want to...
I'm not a reverend. No.
Oh, I'm calling you Reverend. You're Reverend now. I'm making you an honorary Reverend for the tour. And so... and so people by going on...
The first dinner cruise on the harbour, the convicts had quite a different dinner cruise on the harbour than we would have had.
They would have, yeah. But if people want to come on that tour, they'd obviously just go to our website and vision.org.au and //tours. But so we've covered the First Fleet, but what's one of your favourite stories from Australia's Christian heritage? Once the First Fleet lands and the colony starts to develop, what's one of your favourite stories from that period?
Well, yeah, something that runs parallel, and it starts in England and it comes to Australia, Andrew, is the work of a lady called Elizabeth Fry. She was a Quaker, well-to-do, wealthy, in England. And in the early 1800s, she just was appalled when she discovered the conditions that women convicts or prisoners were being kept in. Went into the prison against advice, as they said they'll tear you apart in there. They're like animals. But she went in there, and the women received her with grace, and she said to them, "Look, I can help you, change this. I can bring teachers in here who will teach you and your children, and give you an opportunity to get skills like sewing." So she did that, and she formed a team who were changing the face of women's prisons, not only in England but right across Europe. And part of that was the convict ships that were coming to Australia, and she would take a team down to the ships before they left for Australia, these convict girls, and she would give them a dress and a cap and a sewing kit and a Bible. And there's a beautiful story that comes out of this a little bit later, but it's related to the earliest days, Andrew, and that is on the ship Raja, a little bit later, full of convict girls, she put one of her team on there, a girl called Kezia Hayter, who was only about 20, 21 years old. And on that ship, on the way out, she organised the women to make a quilt. They had been given stuff by the Quaker women in England, the committee, and so they made a quilt, which they gave to the wife of the governor in Tasmania, Jane Franklin, who was a Christian. And that quilt got lost, and eventually it had popped up in England. They found it had been sent back to Elizabeth Fry as a gift, as a thank you. And those girls, they wanted to say thank you to Elizabeth Fry and her team for treating them as human beings, people made in God's image. And that quilt is in the National Gallery. It's the only surviving piece of convict women's craft work. And I love that story. It's fantastic because it sort of tells another story of what women gave to women convicts on the way to Australia and soften the hard edge of transportation and the convict settlement. And it's a story that needs to be known.
Yeah, and it's really Christianity in action, isn't it? It's faith outworking in a practical way and providing dignity and care and concern for the vulnerable. Because as much as these women were convicts, I mean, we all know that some of their crimes. I think my mum's side of the family, there's a female convict that came out in one of the fleets, and all she'd done is steal a little bit of linen, someone's sheet. She was working for a wealthy person, and that was it. She's gone. Came out to Australia. So some of these women were just good women who obviously were poor, and they were probably stealing to give their families something to eat or, provide some shelter or clothing. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was the problem, and women were at the bottom of the heap, really, in every way. They were sort of being mistreated when they came here. And they were sort of easy targets for the blokes, and they were short of women out here. So they were getting a rough time when they arrived, and that's when Carolyn Chisholm stepped in on this end of it, and she started to work alongside Elizabeth Fry and others to change things for the convict women. And she made, 6 or 7 trips to England, which was no small thing. I mean, that's 10,000 miles she had to travel and go around Cape Horn and all that sort of thing. Petitioning the government on behalf of the women here in Australia and changing things. And she set up a system where, with Samuel Marsden, where they try to protect the girls when they arrived and give them a chance to make a decent marriage. And she would even ride with them out to the farms and the properties and set them up with marriages as best she could. But they're extraordinary efforts. I mean, that's why, Carolyn Chisholm's was on our $5 note, so that she's sort of recognised as one of the heroes of the early days. And I've got to say this, the women often did better than the men in terms of changing things here in early Australia.
Why do you think that is, Paul? Why did the women do better?
I think they probably weren't official. They didn't have titles. They didn't have their hands on the levers of power. So women like Elizabeth Macquarie, for example, Governor Macquarie's wife, she was an evangelical, and she was busy forming the Bible Society, was one of the early things in Australia, and the Benevolent Society, which was looking after the poor, the Aboriginal people, and even out into the islands, with a vision to protect and care for them and provide for them, and in particular to share the good news, the gospel, as well as practical care. And the women seemed to have their hands, didn't mind getting their hands dirty, if you'd like to put it that way, in trying to care for people, whereas men often got busy with running stuff, being the officials and making the big decisions. But she backed her husband to make good decisions, and I think they had this quiet influence in the background, if you like. And the same with Elizabeth MacArthur, whose husband John was the father of the wool industry, but also a very hard man. And she, quietly in the background, was engineering similar things. And so those women, I think, had probably a disproportionate impact on the colony.
Yeah, incredible. Well, there are so many lost stories of faith in Australia, aren't there? And that's one of them, these amazing women, again, motivated by Christian faith. And we can just take it for granted, can't we? I think even modern-day historians can look back on that and say, oh, well, yeah, that was just the way she was. But we can just take for granted the fact that she was a Christian. She was motivated by a Christian faith, shaped by the Word of God, her values. And you don't need to look far, do you, Paul, across the world to see other cultures that don't have a Christian influence where that same compassion and care for the vulnerable and the needy and the disadvantaged, it's just not there, is it?
Well, I think it's interesting, Andrew, and this is one of the things I want to bring to the front, because it's not just Christians that are arguing this to sort of, airbrush our history and say it was all good, because it wasn't. The Christians made mistakes. They were people of their time. Sometimes they were narrow-minded. Some they were bickering amongst themselves, the Protestants versus the Catholics, all those sort of things. So it wasn't all pretty, but nevertheless, they oftentimes were the ones who were really engineering good things for our society. So, Samuel Marsden was a sort of controversial figure, but his daughter, she married a guy called William Laurie, and they went to Tonga very early on in the 1830s, and they brought the gospel to Tonga. And she was a very successful missionary there, and it's not realised that those people that I mentioned earlier, the Clapham sect, William Wilberforce and Company, Newton and others, their vision wasn't just for Australia. Their vision was for the whole of the South Pacific. They said the gospel will go to the South Pacific. And, when you think about that, the British government was thinking more about setting up a colony, getting rid of the problem they had with too many people in their prisons, and perhaps setting up some sort of naval base here in the South Pacific. But the Christians were thinking wider. They were saying, how can we bring good news and help the people of the South Pacific? So they were engineering a lot of the early missions to the islands like Fiji and Tonga and Tahiti and so on, were linked to Sydney town and a lot of Marsden himself was doing a missionary work to the Maoris in New Zealand. So there was, for their numbers, they were sort of punching well above their weight. And I love this little story, Andrew, that of all people, Charles Darwin, when he was sailing across the Pacific in the Beagle back in 1850 something or other, on his journey, which was seminal to his writing the Origin of the Species, he made a note in his diary saying, having visited the islands across the Pacific, that the efforts of the Christian missionaries in the Pacific are one of the greatest epics in human history. he was so impressed with what they'd done there, because many of them died there from disease, or a lot of them were killed because they were pretty ferocious people. We liked them as footballers, and they're big, strong men.
Well, some of them are ferocious footballers too, just quietly. I've played with a couple of them.
Well, God designed them for football.
They're great footy players, yeah.
But to think that I got mates who are Tongans and Fijians, and they will tell you, that before, when the first missionaries landed in Fiji, the chief there had 800 heads on poles around his house. It was pretty brave to go. You were pretty brave to go to those islands, and they paid a big price. And in recent years, the islanders, Tongans and Fijians, have actually had sorry days, if you like, to the missionaries. They've invited the descendants of the missionaries back to apologise for what happened to their forefathers.
Amazing.
So there's some beautiful stories, and I think they're lost. We don't realise how much and what a big price many evangelical Christians and others as well paid in bringing the gospel, as well as trying to help. Well, civilise is probably a non-popular word these days, but to bring education and medicine and all those kind of things to the South Pacific.
Dr. Paul, we are going to get on to some meaty subjects shortly, but tell me, this is a 10-day tour. That's a long time. Where will the tour go?
Yeah, it is a long time. I was amazed when I read how long it was. I've done this, a mini version of this a year or two back with Stuart Piggin, and we just went around in the area around Sydney. But they've extended this out through the Blue Mountains to Bathurst. So that's why it's extensive and quite a long tour. And we'll certainly know each other well by the end of it.
Well, and I'm hoping it's not going to be a Burke and Wills tour. That's for sure, though.
Well, thanks.
We've all got smartphones now, GPS trackers, and we'll be fine. We'll be fine. So you start in Sydney. How many days are you going to spend in Sydney?
Now, that's a good question. I think it's about, I've got the itinerary in front of me, I think it goes up to about day 5.
4 or 5, yep. I would have guessed that, yep. And then so from there, then you head up to the Blue Mountains, is it?
Yeah, Blue Mountains out to Bathurst, and then on the rebound they come back through like around Windsor and Richmond, that end of things there, yeah. So it's a bit of a circle.
Yeah, that sounds like a great tour. And so in Sydney, so 4 or 5 days, so, the sites, obviously you've mentioned one of them already, that church. What's the name of that church again that that Reverend Richard Johnson's prayer book's in?
Yeah, that's St. Philip's, yeah.
Yep.
That's good spot. That was really nice, and it's quite a thing to see all that gear and realise, it wasn't an accident that the Christian message came with the First Fleet. I mean, he was pretty brave, Richard Johnson, to preach. His first sermon was under a tree. There's a marker we'll visit, but Psalm 116, what shall we render unto the Lord for all his benefits? And I used to think about that and seeing all these convicts sitting there and thinking, here we are, we've been kicked out of England, we're 10,000 miles away from home, we've got nothing, there's no houses, no nothing. And what are we going to give thanks for? Well, maybe they did. Maybe they were thinking, well, we could be sitting in a jail in England. But it wasn't all that sympathetic here. The soldiers were pretty tough on them, and life was rough. So I don't know. I think, what did he have in mind? Maybe he's saying, well, we got here safely. That's one thing. And we've got an opportunity to do something. The evangelicals were thinking about how they could produce not just a colony, not just a convict settlement, but they were thinking about building a nation, laying the foundations for something really positive in Australia.
Yeah, it is an amazing topic when you think about it. For your first sermon to preach in this brand new colony, and you've got all these convicts in front of you, and you preach about what shall we render to the Lord, and he sounds like a glass half full man, that's for sure. He's obviously trying to pull out the positives, which was, like you said, probably, hey, we're here, we're alive, we haven't died on the journey, we're here, it's a beautiful place. I mean, Sydney Harbour's beautiful, even without development, it would have been just amazing sailing through the heads and finally landing there in Botany on the settlement.
Greatest harbour in the world, I think Philip called it. But I think the thing was, Andrew, too, the officials didn't really support Richard Johnson. They saw him as a bit of an add-on, like you moralised to the convicts, but not to us. And they didn't really help him very much. So he had to battle along himself and build his own church, and and then he tried to do things for the Aboriginal people as well. And I think one of the successes, if you could call it that, was a lady called Burong, and she ended up being Bennelong's third wife, I think. And Bennelong was the one leader amongst the Indigenous people, the Eora in Sydney, that Philip was trying really hard to make some sort of connection, and it got difficult. They just didn't understand each other. You had two totally different cultures, different outlooks on life, and trying to understand each other. And you can, if you add a little bit of sympathy in there for both sides, try to understand what in the world are these people talking about, and they couldn't even speak the language. So Richard Johnson's wife actually took in this girl. She was only a young kid, into the household, and they nursed her and helped her up. She got sick, smallpox, I think, something like that. Anyway, they taught her, and she learned some things, and she used to like hearing the Bible read, and she probably, she gained some literacy, some understanding of what the Christian theology was, although, you can imagine trying to put those two worlds together wasn't easy. But she did end up being something of an agent where Bennelong and others weren't really being cooperative, or it just wasn't working. She sort of became the interpreter to the officials. They used her to sort of be a broker between the white settlers and the Aboriginal people, and they were trying hard to do something about it. She's actually buried in the same place as Bennelong, and that's one of the places we're going to visit.
Oh, that's nice.
I think to sort of honour her as perhaps one of the early, I don't know whether the word convert's right, but there were these people sort of groping towards understanding each other. And I think we've got to be careful to think that, they knew nothing about God before we arrived. Well, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, well, the Bible says that it's written in their hearts. Dr. Paul, just out of interest, whereabouts in outback New South Wales are you from?
I spent 27 years out at Bourke, which is northwest of New South Wales, at the back of Bourke.
Were you at the back of Bourke or the front of Bourke? Where were you in Bourke?
No, we were definitely at the back of Bourke, 20 k's out, so on Woonarring Road.
What were you doing out there? Were you on a property or?
No, a mate and I got together with some friends, and we had a dream back in 1978 that we could help disciple young people in a farm context out there. So we started a thing called Cornerstone Community out there on a cotton farm, and it was a wildcat scheme. And I must admit, I went out there with a certain amount of reservation, thinking, I don't know whether this is going to work, And took my wife and little boy out there, and it was rough times. We camped in a caravan and chopped our own wood and all that sort of stuff for lighting the fire and heating the water. But it was amazing, Andrew. Like, out of that, in that next 27 years, we saw a couple of thousand young people come from all over Australia and beyond, countries all around the world, to come to the back of Bourke, of all places, which had to be a miracle. And we saw amazing things happen there in that context. So they'd work the farm half the day and study half the day was how we worked it. And we were preparing them for a life of mission, to think through carefully, have a Christian worldview, and then go back to wherever they were or engage with mission where they could, and see what we could do to bring the kingdom of God to Australia. So we feel like we're, in terms of our heritage tour, I think trying to own our great story and to sort of build on it. I think stories need roots and wings, and I think what we're trying to do with the heritage tour, Andrew, is to discover our roots, but then we need to give it wings as well. We need to fly this into the future. The new generations need to know this story. So that's been my sort of lot, I suppose, being astride the past generation. Now I'm an older man, and working amongst young people, which I love. To engage them. I get tired of seeing young people with their heads down, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a Christian," because they get so much bad press, and we've done all the bad things, and we're to blame for everything. Well, no question. There are things that the Christian faith has got to apologise for, and there are things that we could have done a lot better, given what we have. But then, on the other hand, there's a lot we don't need to apologise for. And so with these pilgrimages, I call them, the idea, I jumped on board with this one because it was already going. But in the background, Andrew, is a bigger tour. If you think 10 days is big, we're sort of trying to devise our own Camino Trail, if you know that, from France, where there's 250,000 people a year go on that Camino Trail in France into Spain on a spiritual pilgrimage. We want to create one from Sydney out to Alice Springs and beyond, and hopefully to connect to the Indigenous Christians out there, and to take people on a long journey, and to tell stories all along the way using apps and meeting people and so on. So that's the next project. So this is stage one, and that'll be stage two.
I love that. So you've been involved in discipleship out the back of Bourke. Not many people couldn't say they've been to the back of Bourke. I can say I've been to the back of Bourke too, Paul. Like you, I've actually been 2 hours west of Bourke, so that's getting out there.
Really?
But I got a cousin who's a professional shooter, so he went out there to help eradicate some feral pests, so I had to assist him. But we've got a caller, and his name is Gary, and he's from Sydney. Gary, thanks for your patience, and have you got a question or a comment for us today?
Yeah, I'm just inquiring about the tour, and Paul, when you come to Sydney, how close will you be to, say, Campbelltown area?
Oh, you mean as in taking people there?
No, with your tour, your talk, your 10-day tour. You said you plan to come to Sydney.
Yeah, well, it starts in Sydney, Gary, and it goes just a couple of days spent in Sydney itself, and then it skirts out to Parramatta, and then out through the Blue Mountains to Bathurst. So there's a route they've set out here, and they've got sites that we're going to go visit, and so a lot of it's in downtown Sydney, and then a bit further out to Bathurst.
Right.
There's some great stories out your way. I know out at Coverty there's a great story there at near Teen Ranch of the Hassel family out there. Yeah, it's a great place.
Yeah.
Gary, Gary, are you aware of much? Gary, can I ask you a question? Are you aware of much of Australia's Christian history?
Oh, yeah, yes, and I'm also aware of much of Cornerstone history as well.
Oh, really? Oh, no.
Yeah.
Do I know you?
I know, Paul. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. We're being reunited on live radio.
Online.
Yeah.
I see your voice, Gary.
I was in Emerald.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Gary Raw. Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, picture in one. Tell by your voice. That was pretty good, wasn't it?
That's very
anyway.
good.
Well, Gary, I put my hand up to go on the tour, so I reckon you need to put your hand up as well. We'll be the first two attendees. What do you reckon?
Yeah. Have you got it? Will it be somewhere posted where you can?
Well, it's on the website, if you go to vision.org.au/tours, all the information will be on there. So just if you've got access to the internet, just check it out online, and it's going to be in November this year.
Yeah, okay. November. Yeah, all right. I might try and get along.
Gary. That'd be fun.
Yeah. It'd be good to catch up.
Good on you, Gary. Well, mate, thank you for the call, and wish you all the best, brother. God bless. There you go. Hey, reunited on the hotline today, Dr. Paul.
What do you know?
Yeah, so you've got quite an interesting history there, spending more than 20 years out the back of Bourke, discipling young men and women and preparing them for mission. But let's talk about the treatment of the Indigenous, because it's my understanding, Dr. Paul, that the treatment of the Indigenous by the First Fleet was really revolutionary in the sense that they were treated with as much dignity and respect and equality as they could be, and which was way better than other colonies around the world at that time.
Yes and no. I think probably the best answer. I think you've got to realise it's sort of a mixed bag. You've got soldiers, you've got the Rum Corps were a pretty rough and tough group, and the convicts, of course, were a mixed bag. So life was tough, and there weren't many soft edges, if you want to put it that way. And so when there was meetings between the Indigenous people and the settlers, it wasn't always comfortable. And on both sides, there was misunderstandings and things. But by and large, like Philip was given a directive by the by the government, the British government, to treat the natives with respect and to do what he could to be reconciled to them. So he did try pretty hard, although he did cop a spear at once.
But again, that was a misunderstanding, wasn't it? Because he'd already had several positive meetings with the locals in Sydney. But I forget the story, but they misunderstood something one day when he went to visit, and that's when he was speared.
Yeah. There's a lot of that misunderstanding, and it hasn't always been comfortable. I can talk a little bit from the Burke end of things. I know when Charles Sturt and Hamilton Hume arrived out of Burke, they were looking for the inland sea, and they found the Darling River instead. They met the Nyimba people probably there, and there was misunderstanding at first, but Sturt noted in his diary that the Aboriginal people already had been decimated by smallpox ahead of the settlers arriving there. So that's a very true story, very much part of what happened. A lot of the Aboriginal people, particularly around Sydney, died from diseases like smallpox. They just didn't have the resistance to it. So that was a tragedy in itself. And you can understand their reserve about what the white men had brought. And all the misunderstandings, and then just us walking in and taking land or setting up camp on their springs and so on. There was lots of that sort of rough edge, but there were efforts by, we mentioned Johnson and others, the Hassel family and so on, tried hard to sort of make some sort of connection, but it wasn't always easy. And alongside them were some pretty tough settlers who weren't afraid to shoot Aboriginal people and thought they were at the bottom of the pile. And that came partly out of the evolutionary sort of theories that were abounding at the time, that, there was a hierarchy in the peoples of the world, and these Aboriginal people were probably at the bottom of the pile and therefore either uneducatable or not worth converting. And some of the Christians fell into that as well, so there was sort of a very mixed approach. But I do know that Hamilton Hume, for example, he was a young Australian born, and around Sydney he was raised alongside Aboriginal people. He understood them and could speak some languages. So when he arrived at what we call Burke now, with Sturt, who was a Christian, they both were actually, they quickly made peace. Like Hamilton Hume knew if you sat down and threw a branch on the ground, that was a sign pretty well understood across all the tribes and clans that you were there in peace. And so they did sit down and they did communicate. So there were moments like that where there was connection, but there was moments, of course, where the Aboriginal people attacked the settlers because they were, walking into their land and not understanding their rights and so on. So it was a long and difficult connection, and the scattered nature of the people. They didn't have a lot of resistance to the white settlers who were aggressive. But the good stories, I think, are, and I've lived amongst Aboriginal people at Burke and here in Dubbo as well. And one of the things that's emerged for me, Andrew, is that I think there's 6 Aboriginal leaders that are memorialised in Australia. Here in Dubbo, I worked with a local elder to get the statue of William Ferguson put up in the middle of town, because I call him the Martin Luther King of Australia. He led the first civil rights protest in Sydney in 1938. And he was a Christian, an elder in the Presbyterian Church here.
Amazing.
And William Cooper down in Victoria alongside Doug Nicholls. So Doug Nicholls round in AFL, I think, this weekend or last weekend. And Doug Nicholls and his wife are memorialised in front of Parliament House in Melbourne, and they were Christian activists. In fact, Doug Nicholls always made the point when they knighted him and made him Governor of South Australia, he said, "No, I'm not Sir Douglas Nicholls, I'm Pastor Sir Douglas Nicholls." He always held his title as a pastor as higher than being Sir Douglas, and I like that. And then on the $50 note, of course, David Unai, the great inventor and a very, very gifted man, he used to say, his little slogan was, "Well, if you want to know whether the Bible works, look at me."
Wow.
So, and then the one I love, Andrew, is not here in Australia but in Israel, where in recent years they put up a statue memorial for the indigenous light horsemen who fought in the First World War. And would you believe, it's right beside the Sea of Galilee, and it's a horse with a trooper kneeling down and burying a mate, and his name just gone out of my head now, Jack Pollard, his name was, and in his left hand he's got his New Testament. He was a Christian. Now, I just say to people, well, look, you work it out, that all these leaders of the Indigenous people had suffered all the things that the Aboriginal people have suffered across time, and they didn't try to sweep it under the carpet, but they did stand up for their people, and they also adopted the Christian faith as part of the mix. So I think that's a powerful story, and it's not told very often, and it needs to be told, I think.
Yeah, and like you said, there's human failing and there's evil in human nature, across nations and people groups. But I think the thing that stood out to me, though, was, when the first fleet had not even arrived, it was legislated that if anyone murdered one of the Indigenous, they would be treated as a murderer and they would also suffer the death penalty. I do remember reading that. I remember thinking, wow, that's really good that the intent was there, obviously, to treat the Indigenous fairly and equally, and obviously human failing stepped in and injustices and murders and lots of horrible things did happen. But that did stand out to me when I read that.
Well, definitely with the infamous Myall Creek massacre, they did arrest the men who'd done it, and the Catholic magistrate he overturned the initial decision, which was to let them off, and a number of them were hung. So some did implement it, and there were other efforts too, I suppose, up around Lake Macquarie. There was a missionary there who, Ridley, I think his name was, and he worked hard to translate a number of languages, which was quite astonishing what he did, 2 or 3 languages. But then, sadly, the Aboriginal people died out in that area, partly for all the reasons we've talked about. And so that effort was lost. But I know here, where I live in Dubbo, down at Wellington was one of the first missions. A couple of missionaries went up there early, and they rescued the Wiradjuri language, and they wrote it down in hymns and so on in books. And even though the mission sort of failed because the missionaries ended up arguing amongst themselves and they had difficulties with the convicts and the soldiers, and, there were men just taking the Aboriginal girls and all that sort of thing that caused great strife. But nevertheless, in recent years, Stan Grant Sr., who has recovered the Wiradjuri language and taught it, that was how he found it. It was through the work of the missionaries there.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Amazing. And Australia's history is very diverse and very rich, and there's good and there's bad and there's ugly and there's amazing, all wrapped up together, isn't there?
I call it the good, the bad, and the redeemed.
Oh, I like that. The good, the bad, and the redeemed. Just back to the light horsemen. How many light horsemen in World War I were Indigenous? Do you know?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know offhand. It wouldn't have been a lot, but there was a significant number. And, of course, I know there were 3 brothers who went from Bourke to the First World War, fought for Australia, and one of them died in France. But 2 of them came back and they weren't allowed into the RSL. You couldn't get into the...
Terrible.
And that happened everywhere. They weren't allowed in, which was just astonishing. And
well, it's awful, really, to be honest. Let's call it what it is. It's awful. Just terrible.
Yeah. But that has been mended, and I was in the graveyard the day the Knight family up there had a big ceremony when they put markers on the graves of these 2 men. And they were mostly, it was a very strongly Christian ceremony too, I've got to say. And so there's been some beautiful things in that graveyard as well. I don't want to get into graveyards, but a bit further down there's Pastor Bill Reid, and I helped do his service. And Bill was one of the team who worked with Bill Ferguson here to stand up for the civil rights of the native people here in New South Wales. So there's lots of good stories, and Bill Reid was a hero of mine and a beautiful man. And on his grave he had, I am what I am by the grace of God, which I love.
Yeah.
And Doug and Gladys Nichols on their grave down at Cumragunga near Echuca, they have, we strove towards the mark of the high calling in Christ Jesus, So there are some beautiful moments as well that need to be celebrated, as well as the ugly ones we need to face up to. I've got a friend who's an Indigenous pastor, Andrew, and I love. He's got a little saying that I love. He says we need to share our stories, accept our stories, and write a new story together. So I love that. That's great. I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to listen to one another's stories. And, you know, there's two sides to it. Like I've tried to explain to Aboriginal friends, well, my Scots ancestors in the 19th century were driven off the highlands and their land was taken away from them, their ancestral land. They were told to stop speaking Gaelic and they were forced into the cities. And then they got on boats and spread out around the world to Canada and New Zealand and Australia looking for a place to raise their families. Well, they didn't arrive here wanting to rape and pillage and, you know, take over the country. They were just displaced people who were looking for a chance to grow, you know. And I think when I'm able to tell my story and say, well, you know, my ancestors had the similar things happen to them, and we can hear each other. You know, we say that, yeah, I'm listening to your story, brother. You know, I can hear that, and then accept it. You know, I can't apologise, say sorry for all the things that happened back there. I can say that was a terrible thing that happened and it shouldn't have. But then we've got to write a new story together. And I think that's the important thing is the purpose of this journey we're on, this heritage tour, I think, is to make us more intelligent about our faith and what actually happened back there so that we can teach the new generations intelligently you know, what happened. You know, like I think you've got to see, we'll go back to where we began, Andrew, that, you know, that Clapham sect, they were way ahead of the game and they invented all sorts of things. They began the RSPCA, they began the Bible Society, they began all sorts of initiatives for the betterment of the human race. I mean, that's what their big message was, and that was one of the big influences on our settlements here, that they tried to bring humanity and humane treatment and things as best they could to all sorts of people, including convicts and settlers and so on. And they had a very powerful influence on our colony. You can't deny it. And, you know, I work, for example, here in Dubbo, I work as a volunteer in the Royal Flying Doctor Service exhibition. It's a beautiful exhibition, tells the story of Reverend John Flynn in the Flying Doctor Service. Well, in the end, I say to people, look, you know, no Jesus, no Flying Doctor Service. John Flynn did this because he says that, you know, he was challenged by God to do something with his life for our country, and that's what he came up with. Well, that's not forcing religion on people. That's telling them their own story. And that's our great asset, I think, with this tour. What we're trying to do is to say, not that we're blowing our trumpet or not we're trying to pat ourselves on the back or, you know, be triumphalist or something or other, or try to reinstate the old-time religion or the good old days or something like that, but have an intelligent understanding of the journey and then set it to work in our own time with the next generations to say, well, and I stood, boys, for example, in front of John Flynn's grave out at Alice Springs. We went on a pilgrimage all the way to Darwin. A very brave headmaster took a bunch of kids from Wyong all the way up to Darwin. I went with them, telling them these stories as we went. And that was sort of the genesis of this thing I'm planning. But to stand those boys there, kids who grew up on the coast, with little understanding of the inland or the big stories, 16-year-old boys living somewhere between their iPad and McDonald's. Open their eyes and their minds, and to stand them in front of John Flynn's grave there, and beautiful McDonald Rangers, you know, big white gums and things, and his big bowler sitting there. And say, boys, look, John Flynn was 16 when he felt God put a call on his life, just like you are. And he said, I want to do something for Australia. And what are you going to do? You could pick up a bit of quartz off the ground here and put it on his grave to say, you're a great Australian, John. But you could also pray a prayer and say, I want to make my life count for something. And it was amazing. I watched those boys, they squared their shoulders and their heads went up. And that's what I love about this. And that's what drives me, Andrew, is to see the next generations intelligent about their story, their faith stories, but and wanting to write the new story.
That's it. I love how you coined that, mate. Ready to write the new story. Reverend Dr. Paul, keep saying it. Maybe it's going to happen. Dr. Paul, I just want to thank you. So we're going to have to cut it here because we're going over time now, but I could listen to you all day talk about Australia's Christian history. But just to remind our listeners, on the 9th of November this year, Dr. Paul Rowe is taking a tour for 10 days, and it's called the Discover Australia's Christian Heritage Tour. If you want to find out more information, it's at vision.org.au/tours. Go to that on our website, register for it. It will be a tour of a lifetime. You'll discover all about Australia's rich Christian history with the one and only Dr. Paul Rowe, who's joined us today. And if you want to find out more about Dr. Paul, go to the outbackhistorian.com.au. That's the outbackhistorian.com.au. And Paul, I want to thank you so much again for joining us on 2020 today.
Andrew, can I just say with that website, there's a stack of stories there I've been researching, and they're up there. So if people are interested in the stories, they can get in now, today, and they'll find lots of these stories there under headings. And if you go to the site and then go to stories, there's a great list of stories. Some of them are audio, some of them are visuals, some of them are blogs.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. So go to the outbackhistorian.com.au. There's a whole section of stories. Dr. Paul, thanks again, and you have a wonderful day out there in Dubbo.
Okay, Andrew. Thank you. Good on you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.